I never saw it coming. Not at first. I think back to that morning, standing in our kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as it sputtered to life. The house was quiet except for the hum of appliances and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Angela was upstairs, taking her time, getting ready for another day at her job in real estate. She'd always loved the mornings, said they gave her clarity. I was the opposite. Mornings were a grind for me, a series of autopilot rituals to get out the door. But that day felt different. Off. She came downstairs eventually, her heels clicking against the wood floor. She was dressed sharper than usual. Tailored blazer, pencil skirt, heels that added 3 inches to her already commanding height. Her hair was done, her makeup flawless, and the subtle waft of perfume filled the kitchen. I raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment. Angela always dressed well, but this felt deliberate, like she was dressing for someone. Running late? I asked, glancing at the clock. She waved me off, tossing her bag onto the counter. A client meeting, she said, flipping her hair over her shoulder. They're loaded. It could mean a big commission for us. I nodded, trying not to read into it. But something about her tone, the way she said it, didn't sit right. She grabbed her keys, barely sparing me a glance before heading for the door. You should make dinner tonight, she said over her shoulder. I'll be late, probably back around 10. I watched her leave, a strange feeling settling in my chest. The thing is, Angela and I had been together for 12 years. We weren't perfect. No one is, but we'd always been solid. She was ambitious, driven, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and command attention. I'd always admired that about her, even when it felt like I was playing second fiddle to her career. I thought we had an understanding, a partnership. But that morning, as I sat there sipping my coffee, something gnawed at me, a whisper I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Angela had never given me a reason to doubt her, and I wasn't about to start imagining problems where there weren't any. Still, the feeling lingered. That evening, she came home later than expected. I was on the couch, half watching a game, when I heard the door open. She walked in with her heels in hand, looking tired but satisfied, like someone who just closed a deal. I asked how the meeting went. She shrugged, pouring herself a glass of wine. Fine, she said. The client was demanding, but I think I made an impression. Her response was so casual, so nonchalant, that it almost disarmed me. But as she sat across from me, scrolling through her phone, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. She was smiling. Not at me, not in response to anything I'd said, but at something on her screen. Who are you texting? I asked, keeping my tone light. She looked up, her smile fading just slightly. No one, she said. Just work stuff. She locked her phone and stood, stretching like she was ready to call it a night. Don't wait up, she said. I'm exhausted. As she disappeared upstairs, I sat there, the whisper in my mind growing louder. Angela had always been confident, almost to a fault. But that night, there was something else, a flicker of guilt, a subtle shift in her demeanor I couldn't ignore. I didn't want to believe it, but a part of me already knew. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. Angela's late nights became more frequent after that. She always had a reason, a demanding client, a networking event, a last-minute showing. At first, I didn't question it. She was good at her job, and real estate wasn't exactly a 9-to-5 gig. But the excuses started piling up. One evening, I came home earlier than usual and found her in the bathroom, fixing her hair. She jumped when she saw me in the mirror, her expression tight for a split second before she forced a smile. You scared me, she said, brushing off the moment like it was nothing. She was wearing lipstick I hadn't seen before, bold, red, striking. Angela wasn't the type to wear something like that for a casual client meeting. Another night, I found a receipt tucked in her purse while looking for her keys. It was for a fancy rooftop bar downtown, the kind of place we never went to. I didn't ask her about it. Not yet. The whispers in my mind turned into a dull roar the day I found her phone on the counter, buzzing with a text from someone named D. I don't usually snoop. I hate the idea of invading someone's privacy, but my gut told me to pick it up. The message read, "Can't stop thinking about last night." I felt like the ground beneath me shifted. My breath caught, my hands trembling as I stared at the words. She came into the kitchen moments later, snatching the phone off the counter before I could put it down. Her movements were quick, almost defensive. I asked who Dee was. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Just smiled and said it was a client. She laughed, brushing past me. He's harmless, she said. Just likes to flirt. Her answer was too smooth, too rehearsed. I started paying closer attention. Angela had routines, habits she rarely deviated from. But lately, there were inconsistencies. She left for work earlier, came home later, and always had a reason she couldn't stay for dinner. Her phone was glued to her hand now, always locked, always flipped screen down when she set it on the table. She started taking long showers, more than usual, and her perfume lingered in the air in a way that made my stomach turn. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. I wanted to believe her, to trust her. But then I noticed the way she smiled when she looked at her phone, the same smile she used to give me. One Saturday, while Angela was at a showing, I took a drive to the address of the rooftop bar on the receipt. It was in a trendy part of town, surrounded by upscale restaurants and boutique shops. I parked across the street and waited. Sure enough, after about an hour, Angela walked out of the building with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, with an air of confidence that grated on me immediately. She laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his arm as they walked to his car. I felt a surge of anger, but I stayed put, watching as they drove off together. When she came home that night, she acted like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, told me about a difficult client, and sat down to check emails like nothing had happened. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, nodded, and pretended not to notice the faint trace of cologne that wasn't mine. If Angela thought she could lie her way out of this, she was wrong. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. First, I needed proof. Then I needed a plan. After seeing Angela with Dee, there was no denying it anymore. She was cheating, lying to my face, slipping away into a life she thought I'd never notice. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation would give her control, let her twist the narrative, make excuses, and turn the blame on me. No, I needed to build my case piece by damning piece. If Angela wanted to play games, I was going to beat her at her own. The first step was a GPS tracker. It was small, discreet, and easy to install under her car one evening when she was in the shower. It synced to an app on my phone, letting me see exactly where she went and when. The second was a hidden camera, disguised as a clock, placed in the corner of our living room. Angela often made her phone calls there, pacing while she spoke, thinking I was too busy or too indifferent to listen. The third was a voice recorder, slipped into her purse. It was risky, she could discover it, but I was careful. I only needed a few snippets of confirmation. The tracker pinged almost immediately. Angela's late-night showings weren't at the office or a property. They were at restaurants, bars, and, more often than not, a boutique hotel downtown. She was meeting Dee at least 3 times a week, their movements like clockwork. I started to notice patterns. She'd leave the house in her business clothes, but change into something more provocative before their meetings. She'd return home hours later, the faint scent of cologne clinging to her skin, her excuses carefully rehearsed. It was all so calculated, so deliberate. The camera footage filled in the blanks. One evening, while I was supposedly working late, Angela came home and made a call. She laughed softly, her voice low and intimate. I couldn't hear the other side, but her words were enough to make my blood boil. Miss you too. I can't stop thinking about it. Tonight was perfect. I saved the recording, labeling it for the growing file I'd created. A folder of screenshots, GPS logs, and now video evidence that painted a crystal-clear picture of her betrayal. But the voice recorder was the most damning. On a Thursday afternoon, I retrieved it from her purse while she was showering. When I played it back, I heard fragments of a conversation she'd had with Dee. He asked her how long she planned to keep the charade going. She laughed, her tone dismissive. As long as it takes, she said. He's clueless. Besides, it's not like he pays attention to me anymore. The bitterness in her voice stung more than I expected. I stared at the growing pile of evidence, my stomach churning. It was enough to confront her, enough to destroy the life she thought she could keep hidden. But that wasn't enough for me. Angela needed to feel what I was feeling. She needed to understand what it meant to have everything she'd built fall apart, piece by piece. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to take her world apart. After seeing Angela with D, there was no denying it anymore. She was cheating, lying to my face, slipping away into a life she thought I'd never notice. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation would give her control. Let her twist the narrative, make excuses, and turn the blame on me. No, I needed to build my case, piece by damning piece. If Angela wanted to play games, I was going to beat her at her own. The first step was a GPS tracker. It was small, discreet, and easy to install under her car one evening when she was in the shower. It synced to an app on my phone, letting me see exactly where she went and when. The second was a hidden camera, disguised as a clock, placed in the corner of our living room. Angela often made her phone calls there, pacing while she spoke, thinking I was too busy or too indifferent to listen. The third was a voice recorder, slipped into her purse. It was risky, she could discover it, but I was careful. I only needed a few snippets of confirmation. The tracker pinged almost immediately. Angela's late-night showings weren't at the office or a property. They were at restaurants, bars, and, more often than not, a boutique hotel downtown. She was meeting D at least 3 times a week, their movements like clockwork. I started to notice patterns. She'd leave the house in her business clothes, but change into something more provocative before their meetings. She'd return home hours later, the faint scent of cologne clinging to her skin, her excuses carefully rehearsed. It was all so calculated, so deliberate. The camera footage filled in the blanks. One evening, while I was supposedly working late, Angela came home and made a call. She laughed softly, her voice low and intimate. I couldn't hear the other side, but her words were enough to make my blood boil. Miss you too. I can't stop thinking about it. Tonight was perfect. I saved the recording, labeling it for the growing file I'd created. A folder of screenshots, GPS logs, and now video evidence that painted a crystal-clear picture of her betrayal. But the voice recorder was the most damning. On a Thursday afternoon, I retrieved it from her purse while she was showering. When I played it back, I heard fragments of a conversation she'd had with D. He asked her how long she planned to keep the charade going. She laughed, her tone dismissive. As long as it takes, she said. He's clueless. Besides, it's not like he pays attention to me anymore. The bitterness in her voice stung more than I expected. I stared at the growing pile of evidence, my stomach churning. It was enough to confront her, enough to destroy the life she thought she could keep hidden. But that wasn't enough for me. Angela needed to feel what I was feeling. She needed to understand what it meant to have everything she'd built fall apart, piece by piece. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to take her world apart. To be continued. Ви сказали. Next part. Программа «Чат-GPT сказала». Part 4. Setting the stage. Angela had no idea I was on to her. She went about her days like nothing had changed, slipping seamlessly between her life with me and her secret rendezvous with D. But I wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the explosive, irrational way I might have been if I confronted her immediately. Now I was cold, calculated, focused. If Angela thought she could manipulate me, lie to me, and humiliate me without consequence, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The first step in my plan was subtle sabotage. I started with her work. Angela prided herself on her professional reputation, her ability to close deals, charm clients, and outmaneuver her competition. She loved telling me about her successes, about how indispensable she was to her company. But her affair had created cracks in that image. I used one of the voice recordings from her purse, a particularly damning snippet where she referred to a client as an idiot who doesn't know what he wants but will pay anything if I flirt enough. I sent it anonymously to her boss, attaching a message that read, "This might interest you." A few days later, Angela came home seething. She slammed her bag on the counter and poured herself a drink, her movements sharp and angry. I asked what was wrong, feigning concern. She shook her head, muttering something about office politics and someone trying to sabotage me. I smiled to myself as I sipped my coffee. The next step was her social life. Angela had a tight-knit group of friends, women she'd known for years, women who believed she had the perfect marriage and the perfect career. She thrived on their admiration, their envy. Using the burner phone I'd purchased, I sent an anonymous text to her best friend, Katie. Angela isn't who you think she is. Check out the attached photos. The photos showed Angela and Dee at the boutique hotel, laughing and holding hands. Just enough to plant seeds of doubt. Katie didn't reply to the message, but Angela came home that night quieter than usual, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. By the weekend, she was complaining that Katie had been distant and acting weird. I told her I was sure it was nothing, hiding the satisfaction bubbling just beneath the surface. Then came the financials. Angela had never paid much attention to our accounts. I handled the bills, the investments, everything. She trusted me to keep things running smoothly, which made it easy to take control. I moved money from our joint savings into a separate account in my name. Nothing too drastic, nothing that would raise alarm, just enough to ensure that when the time came, I had the upper hand. I also reviewed her spending. The receipts for fancy dinners, hotels, and boutique shopping trips became part of my growing file. She didn't notice a thing. The final step in setting the stage was gathering allies. I reached out to a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Clara who specialized in high-stakes divorces. I handed over everything I'd collected, the tracker logs, the recordings, the financials, and the photos. She raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the file. "This is airtight," she said. "You could walk away with everything if you play this right." I nodded. I don't just want to walk away. I want her to feel it. Clara leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Then you've come to the right place." Angela's world was still intact, at least on the surface. She was still smiling, still confident, still convinced she had me fooled. But she didn't realize the ground beneath her feet was already starting to crumble. I was going to make sure she felt every piece of it fall. Angela's life was starting to fray at the edges. She didn't realize it yet, but I could see the strain in the way she carried herself. Her smiles a little too forced, her stories a little too rehearsed. She was balancing on a knife's edge, and I was the one tilting the blade. The first real crack appeared at her office. She came home one evening, her face pale, her posture stiff. She dropped her bag by the door and went straight to the kitchen for a drink, not even bothering to greet me. "Rough day?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She nodded, her jaw tight. "They're auditing client accounts," she said. "Someone reported me for unprofessional conduct." I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "That's ridiculous. You're one of their top agents." She laughed bitterly, tossing back her drink. "People get jealous," she said, staring into her empty glass. "They'll do anything to take you down." I hid my satisfaction behind a sip of my own drink. Her friendships were next. Katie, her closest friend, had always been her confidant, her partner in crime during wine nights and shopping sprees. But now, Katie wasn't answering her calls. Angela complained about it one evening, pacing the living room with her phone in hand. "I don't know what her problem is," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "She's been ignoring me for days." "Maybe she's just busy," I offered. "Or maybe you said something that upset her." Angela glared at me, her frustration boiling over. "I haven't done anything wrong," she snapped. "Haven't you?" I wanted to say, but I kept my mouth shut. The GPS tracker and camera continued to deliver damning evidence. Angela wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was getting bolder. The tracker showed her car at the boutique hotel 3 times that week, always during client meetings. The camera in the living room caught her on the phone with Dee, her voice soft and intimate. She told him she missed him, that she couldn't wait until the weekend, that I was clueless. It was almost laughable how careless she'd become. I decided it was time to escalate. The next morning, after she left for work, I opened her laptop and composed an email. It was addressed to the HR department at her company, outlining her unethical behavior and attaching several incriminating photos of her and Dee. I didn't sign it, of course, just hit send and close the laptop. By the afternoon, Angela called me in a panic. "They're calling me in for a meeting tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone sent them photos of me and a client." I kept my voice calm, neutral. "That doesn't sound good," I said. "Do you know who might have done it?" She didn't answer, her breathing uneven on the other end of the line. That evening, she was quieter than usual. She picked at her dinner, barely touched her wine, and disappeared upstairs without a word. I followed her movements on the camera feed later. watching as she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her phone. She tried calling Dee, but he didn't answer. For the first time, she looked afraid. The cracks in her world were widening, and she was running out of excuses, out of people to turn to. But I wasn't done yet. The real devastation was still to come. Angela's confidence had all but evaporated. She moved through the house like a shadow, her shoulders hunched, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as if it were a lifeline. I watched her closely, the tension in her every move confirming what I already knew. Her world was starting to collapse. But I wasn't done pushing. The meeting with her HR department happened 2 days later. She came home that evening, her face pale, her hands trembling as she poured herself a drink. "They think I violated company policy," she said, her voice shaking. "They're reviewing my accounts, my emails, everything." I leaned back in my chair, feigning concern. "Did they say who reported you?" She shook her head, taking a long sip of her wine. "No, but someone sent them photos. Of me and—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. I tilted my head, watching her carefully. "You and who?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "Just a client. It's nothing." Her lie was so transparent it was almost laughable. But I didn't press. Let her squirm. Let her dig her own grave. Her friendship with Katie was the next domino to fall. Angela finally cornered her at a coffee shop, desperate to mend whatever rift had formed. I knew this because I was there, parked across the street, watching through the cafe's wide windows. I couldn't hear what was being said, but the body language was enough. Angela gestured wildly, her expression pleading, while Katie sat stiffly, her arms crossed. At one point, Katie held up her phone, showing Angela something that made her face blanch. I didn't need to guess what it was. When Angela returned home that evening, she went straight to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Meanwhile, I continued building my case. I reviewed our shared accounts, compiling a detailed record of Angela's spending. The boutique hotel charges, the fancy dinners, the shopping sprees. Each transaction was another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin. I also reached out to my lawyer, Clara, who assured me that the growing pile of evidence was more than enough to secure a favorable divorce settlement. "She's reckless," Clara said during one of our calls. "She thinks she's untouchable. That's going to work in your favor." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a grim satisfaction. Angela's recklessness had been her undoing. The final crack came when Dee decided to cut ties. One evening, while Angela was out, I checked the camera feed from the living room. She came home later than usual, her face red, her movements frantic. She paced the room, her phone pressed to her ear. "You're seriously ending this now?" she hissed into the phone. "After everything? You're a coward, you know that?" Her voice broke on the last word, and she sank onto the couch, her shoulders shaking. I sat in my car, parked a block away, watching it all unfold on my phone. Dee was gone. Her work was hanging by a thread. Her friends had turned their backs on her, and she still had no idea I was behind it all. That night, she sat in the kitchen, staring blankly at the table. I joined her, sitting across from her, watching as she tried to hold herself together. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice soft. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy, her expression hollow. "I don't know," she said. For the first time, there was no deflection, no excuses. Just raw, unfiltered fear. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But Angela wasn't the victim here. The real fallout was still coming. Angela wasn't sleeping. I could hear her pacing upstairs late into the night, her footsteps light but frantic. Sometimes she'd pause, her muffled voice drifting through the walls as she made hushed phone calls. The cracks in her life were no longer just cracks, they were gaping wounds. Her work, her friendships, her affair with Dee. Everything she'd used to construct her double life was falling apart. But I wasn't finished yet. The next step in my plan was to isolate her further. I started with her family. Angela's parents lived a few hours away and had always been supportive of her, though I suspected they didn't know the full extent of her betrayal. I sent an anonymous email to her father, attaching a few choice pieces of evidence. Photos of Angela with Dee, screenshots of their messages, and a brief explanation of her actions. I didn't sign the email, but the subject line was clear: "Your daughter needs help." A few days later, Angela received a phone call from her father. I watched through the hidden camera as she sat on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear, her face contorted with a mix of anger and humiliation. "I don't know what you've heard, but it's not true," she said, her voice trembling. "Dad, you have to believe me. He's twisting everything." I didn't need to hear the other side to know her father wasn't convinced. When she hung up, she threw her phone onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. Her job was the next to go. I received an update from my lawyer, Clara, who had been monitoring the fallout from my anonymous tip to her employer. "They've terminated her," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "It's official. They cited inappropriate conduct and a breach of company policy." I nodded, a grim smile tugging at my lips. When Angela came home that evening, she didn't say a word. She walked past me, went straight to the bedroom, and shut the door. By now, Angela's world was crumbling faster than she could keep up with. The whispers among her friends had turned into full-blown avoidance. Her work was gone, and Dee was no longer answering her calls. She tried to keep up appearances, but the strain was obvious. Her once flawless outfits were wrinkled, her makeup hurried and uneven. She barely spoke to me, and when she did, her voice was flat, lifeless. But I wasn't done. The final piece of the puzzle was her reputation. Angela had always thrived on the admiration of others. Her co-workers, her friends, even casual acquaintances. She loved being seen as successful, put together, enviable. So I decided to take that away too. Using the burner phone, I sent an anonymous email to a local gossip blog that specialized in community scandals. The email included a detailed account of Angela's affair, her professional misconduct, and the fallout from her termination. I attached the same evidence I'd sent to her employer and friends. The article went live a few days later, accompanied by the headline, "Local Real Estate Agent's Double Life Exposed." Angela found out about the article when one of her few remaining acquaintances sent her the link. She came storming into the living room, her face red with rage, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Did you do this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. I looked up from the book I was reading, keeping my expression neutral. "Do what?" She threw her phone onto the coffee table, the article glaring up at me from the screen. I picked it up, pretending to read. When I looked back at her, I shrugged. "Looks like someone's been keeping secrets." Her face crumpled, her anger giving way to desperation. "Floyd, you have to help me," she said, her voice breaking. "People are turning against me. I don't know who's doing this, but it's ruining my life." I stood, setting the phone down carefully. "Maybe," I said, my voice cold. "You should think about what you've done to deserve it." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. She wasn't ready to admit it yet, but she was starting to realize the truth. Her destruction wasn't random. It was deliberate, and it was far from over. Angela was unraveling. Her once unshakable composure was gone, replaced by a frantic, broken version of the woman I used to know. She barely left the house anymore, her phone a constant source of torment as she watched her life fall apart piece by piece. But she hadn't yet connected the dots. She didn't know I was behind it. Not yet. It was a Friday evening when I decided it was time to confront her. The timing was deliberate. Her emotional defenses were already at their lowest after losing her job, her friends, and her standing in the community. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a glass of wine she hadn't touched. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I walked in, holding the folder I'd been building for weeks. It was thick, overflowing with evidence. Photos, messages, receipts, and a timeline of every lie she'd told, every betrayal she'd committed. She didn't notice me at first, too lost in her thoughts. When I set the folder down on the table in front of her, she flinched, her eyes snapping up to meet mine. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. I didn't answer. I just sat down across from her, watching as she hesitantly opened the folder. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the contents, her face draining of color with every page. The photos of her and Dee at the hotel. The text messages I'd pulled from her phone. The GPS logs showing her repeated trips to places she'd claimed she'd never been. When she reached the screenshots of her financial indiscretions, her breath hitched. This isn't what it looks like," she stammered, her voice shaking. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Then what is it, Angela? Enlighten me. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. It's not Floyd, I can explain. Stop, I said, cutting her off. My voice was calm, but firm. I don't want to hear your excuses. I've been listening to your lies for months, and I'm done. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I stood, pacing the room as I spoke. I gave you everything, Angela. My trust, my loyalty, my time. And this is how you repay me? By sneaking around, lying to my face, and blaming me for your choices. She started to cry, burying her face in her hands. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she said, her voice muffled. I was unhappy, Floyd. You stopped paying attention to me. I felt invisible. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. So instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you decided to cheat? To betray me? That's your excuse. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I leaned over the table, my voice low but steady. Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't erase the damage you've done. I slid a second folder across the table. This one was thinner, containing only a single document. The divorce papers. Her eyes widened as she read the title, her hands trembling. I've already filed, I said, watching her reaction closely. You'll be hearing from my lawyers soon. The evidence I've gathered ensures you'll get next to nothing. The house, the savings, even the car, it's all mine now. She shook her head, her voice breaking. Floyd, please. Don't do this. We can work through this. I can change. You already changed, I said coldly. You just didn't tell me. For the first time in our marriage, Angela was speechless. She stared at the papers in front of her, the weight of her choices finally sinking in. You think you're the victim here, I continued, my voice steady. But you're not. You destroyed us, Angela. Not me. She didn't respond. She just sat there, her shoulders slumped, her tears falling silently onto the table. I left her like that, retreating to the bedroom and locking the door behind me. The confrontation was over, but the fallout had only just begun. Angela didn't leave the kitchen that night. When I came downstairs the next morning, she was still sitting there, her face pale, the divorce papers untouched in front of her. Her glass of wine from the night before sat half empty, the red liquid staining the sides like dried blood. She looked up at me with hollow eyes. Is this really what you want? She asked, her voice raw. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us heavy. What I want doesn't matter anymore, I said, not meeting her gaze. What matters is what's left, and you've burned through all of it. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying again. But instead, she sat up straighter, a flicker of defiance in her expression. This isn't all on me, Floyd, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You weren't perfect. You ignored me for years. I set my coffee down hard enough to make her flinch. Don't you dare, I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Don't try to pin this on me. I was here, Angela. Every single day, I was here. You're the one who walked away. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Over the next few days, Angela made a feeble attempt to reconcile. She cooked dinner, cleaned the house, even tried to initiate a conversation about starting fresh. But it was too late. The damage was done, and I wasn't interested in pretending everything could go back to the way it was. One evening, she cornered me in the living room, her desperation bubbling to the surface. Floyd, I'm begging you, she said, her voice cracking. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. I stood, my expression cold. This isn't something you can fix with a few apologies and promises, I said. You made your choices, Angela. Now you have to live with them. She crumpled onto the couch, her sobs muffled by her hands. I watched her for a moment, a mix of anger and pity swirling in my chest. But I didn't comfort her. I couldn't. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to the mountain of evidence I'd collected. Clara, my lawyer, was ruthless, ensuring that I walked away with everything. Angela, on the other hand, was left with almost nothing. The house? Mine. The savings? Mine. Her reputation? In shambles. She tried to fight it at first, but every argument she made crumbled under the weight of the truth. By the time the papers were finalized, she didn't have the energy to argue anymore. A week after the divorce was finalized, Angela moved out. I didn't ask where she was going, and she didn't volunteer the information. She left with a single suitcase and the car I'd begrudgingly let her keep. When she stood at the door for the last time, she hesitated, turning to look at me one final time. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my expression unreadable. "Goodbye, Angela." She lingered for a moment before stepping out the door, the sound of her suitcase wheels fading into the distance. The house felt different after she left. Quieter, lighter. I spent the first few days alone, sorting through the remnants of our life together. I found old photos, letters, and mementos that once meant something, but now felt like artifacts of another life. I packed them away, one box at a time, until the house was finally mine. Angela's name still came up occasionally, through mutual acquaintances, whispers in the community, even a brief mention in a local gossip blog. Apparently, she was struggling to rebuild her life. Her former friends had cut ties. Her professional reputation was ruined, and her attempts to find new work were met with closed doors and judgmental glances. Part of me felt sorry for her, but another part, the part that had endured her lies, her betrayal, her complete disregard for everything we'd built, felt nothing at all. The fallout was complete. Angela's life had crumbled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The day Angela left marked the true beginning of my new life. At first, the silence in the house was disorienting, almost too loud. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. There was no tension, no walking on eggshells, no wondering what lies were being whispered behind my back. Just me, the house, and the clean slate I had carved out of the wreckage. I threw myself into rebuilding. The house needed repairs, both literal and emotional. I repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and replaced every trace of Angela's influence. The bed, the curtains, the dishes, everything that reminded me of her was either sold or thrown out. It was cathartic, a physical act of reclaiming my space, my life. I started running again, something I hadn't done in years. It gave me a sense of control, a way to clear my mind. Most mornings, I'd find myself on the trails near the lake, the sound of my footsteps and the rustle of leaves the only company I needed. It was during one of these runs that I met Heather. She was sitting on a bench, tying her shoes, when I jogged past. I might not have noticed her if not for the way she smiled, bright, genuine, the kind of smile that stops you in your tracks. We struck up a conversation, first about the trails, then about everything else. She was a teacher, newly divorced, with a sharp wit and a calm energy that I found myself drawn to. We started meeting for coffee after our runs, and over time, those casual conversations turned into something deeper. One evening, as we sat on the porch of my newly redecorated house, Heather asked about my past. I hesitated, not sure how much to share, but something about her made me feel safe, like I didn't have to hide anymore. I told her everything, the betrayal, the revenge, the painstaking process of piecing my life back together. She listened without judgment, her expression thoughtful. "You've been through hell," she said softly, "but you didn't let it break you." Her words stuck with me. Angela reached out once, months after the divorce. Her email was short, apologetic, filled with empty promises about how she'd changed and how she wanted to make amends. I didn't reply. She was part of my past now, a chapter one had closed. As the seasons changed, so did my life. Heather and I grew closer, building something rooted in honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real. And after everything I'd been through, that was enough. One morning, as we sat by the lake watching the sunrise, Heather turned to me and asked if I was happy. I thought about her question, about everything that had led me to this moment. For the first time in years, my answer came easily. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I am." The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was better, stronger, and it was finally mine. So, what do you think about my story? Drop a comment with your thoughts on my decision and how you would have handled it.